Only 7 days remained before our wedding when the foundation collapsed. I stood inside the Suffolk County Registry of Deeds in Boston and uncovered the title fraud. Our future historic studio was registered entirely under his brother's name, Austin. I didn't scream. I went back to my desk and quietly submitted an emergency request to freeze the $110,000 my parents contributed, hoping the administrative gears would turn in time. I canceled the wedding that night, leaving Taylor's family in the wreckage of their calculated scam. Would you have walked away in that exact moment, or stayed to watch how deep the cracks really went? I closed my laptop with a soft, calculated click. The sharp sound disappeared into the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass of the Charles Street Coffee House, where old Boston money usually came to mask its transactions. I didn't call Taylor in an emotional panic. I didn't storm his family's ancestral investment practice to demand a cheap display of regret. As a restoration architect, I have spent my entire career learning that when you uncover a fatal structural defect in a load-bearing wall, exposing it prematurely only allows an unprincipled contractor to patch over the surface with cosmetic plaster while the underlying timber continues to rot. I needed a full forensic diagnostic before I adjusted the weight of the structure. Later that evening, I sat across from Taylor at a historic, dark-paneled tavern near the Boston Harbor. He was entirely inside his element. He smoothly pulled out my heavy oak chair, adjusted the silver table settings, and ordered my favorite seafood dish with the identical, protective grace that had drawn me to him during our college years. His performance was seamless. He spoke casually about his mother Amanda's wedding timeline for selecting antique mahogany furniture for our residential suite, his voice perfectly modulated, his posture completely relaxed. If I hadn't spent the afternoon tracing the digital code logs of the Beacon Hill title registry, I would have dissolved into his attentiveness, continuing to dream of a home that was mathematically designed to exclude me. What stayed with me wasn't the deception itself, but the absolute normalness of his breathing across the table. I can admit now that a person who can calmly ask what you want for dinner while systematically stripping away your legitimate financial rights is far more dangerous than an open adversary. It requires a rare, cold sort of calculation to market an eviction as a form of protection. Every time I shifted the conversation toward the final processing date of the occupancy permit, I observed the subtle anomalies in his frame. There was a microfractional tightening of his fingers around the stem of his crystal wine glass, a defensive structural response he didn't realize he was broadcasting to an architect. He cleared his throat, smoothly deflecting the technical questions by using his family's historical prestige as an unquantifiable shield. He laughed softly, telling me that a marriage based on true heritage doesn't require a constant audit of paper. He leaned over the table, his eyes reflecting the warm candlelight, completely unaware that his mask had already slipped. I drove down to Quincy early the next morning. The gray granite quarries passed outside my window like cold markers of an unyielding history. The $110,000 I had wired into the restoration fund wasn't corporate capital or a casual venture injection. It was the entire, unvarnished life savings of my parents. For 30 years, my father had run a small masonry preservation business, restoring ancient chimneys and settling stone foundations across Massachusetts, working through brutal New England winters until his knuckles were permanently swollen and split by the lime dust in the freezing cold. They had lived with secondhand utility vehicles, ignored structural leaks in their own kitchen ceiling, and purchased generic brand groceries, saving dollar by dollar. It was an accumulation of physical sacrifice, born not out of a desire for eventual luxury, but out of an absolute, unspoken devotion to my professional future. When Taylor's mother, Amanda, had smoothly suggested that my family contribute the primary liquidity for the structural restoration of the Beacon Hill estate while they provided the raw property asset, my parents didn't hesitate. They sat at our worn kitchen table, handing over the banking slips with the quiet, profound reverence of old craftsmen passing down a hard-won inheritance. They trusted that an established family legacy meant an unshakable boundary of honor. I looked down at the copy of the bank transfer receipt resting in my lap, feeling an immense, suffocating weight. I can admit now that part of me saw the shifting lines earlier than I wanted to. High-achieving, independent professionals are often the most optimal targets for quiet exploitation because we are systematically conditioned to believe that any structural failure in a relationship is simply a problem we haven't worked hard enough to solve. We are trained to become the silent investors in someone else's security, spending our own emotional and financial capital to preserve an artificial harmony. I had allowed Taylor and his mother to mistake my professional containment for compliance, treating my independence as an automated, interest-free funding mechanism for their hidden liabilities. I had treated their version of family affection as a stable asset, when in reality, it was a volatile subscription model where I was the only one footing the bill. Compassion had become a resource they had overdrafted for years, and the final invoice had just arrived. My father walked out to the gravel driveway to wave goodbye, his canvas work jacket worn thin at the elbows and his boots stained with dried white mortar dust. He stood there, smiling in the crisp morning air, completely unaware that the family we were trying so hard to join had already classified his 30 years of physical labor as a voluntary, uncredited asset injection. The trap closed completely during Sunday lunch. We had been summoned to Amanda Sullivan's ancestral brick home in Beacon Hill, an old environment that felt suffocatingly formal, heavy with the scent of silver polish and generations of burnt beeswax. The historic portraits on the walls stared down with cold, institutional authority, anchoring the room in a legacy that was actively dying behind the scenes. Midway through the meal, Amanda set down her porcelain cup with a sharp, calculated clack that caused the ambient room chatter to instantly vanish. With her face meticulously arranged into an expression of deep, maternal concern, she smoothly delivered the financial demand. She stated that the city's Historical Zoning Commission had encountered a structural variance in our renovation logs. Before the commercial bank would release the final construction line for my independent preservation studio, my family would need to immediately inject an additional $35,000 to cover the emergency compliance fees. I sat perfectly still, my eyes tracking Taylor. He didn't blink. He kept his gaze pinned to his gold-rimmed plate, cutting his meat with precise mechanical movements, silently endorsing his mother's extortion. The anger inside me wasn't loud. It was entirely clinical. I looked at the mother and son and recognized that this was the exact moment their layer of artificial sweetness was designed to dissolve. I didn't trigger a chaotic argument or show a single trace of emotional panic. Instead, I simply asked, with absolute innocence, to see the certified copies of the Historical Commission's compliance invoices so I could pass them to my father's independent CPA for standard cross-referencing before our side dispersed the capital. Taylor dropped his silver fork onto the edge of the fine china with a heavy, echoing clack that resonated through the quiet room. His usual soft warmth vanished, replaced by an icy, defensive irritation as he leaned back in his upholstered chair and stared at me. He accused me of being cold and rigid, bringing a litigation mindset into what should be a sacred family covenant. He told me that a marriage based on true heritage does not require a constant audit of paper or numbers, and that my skepticism was explicitly damaging our trust. Amanda smoothly joined the offensive, her weaponized sweetness fracturing into a sharp, structural lecture about how a girl from Quincy should understand her position. She stated that I needed to recognize my place and display basic gratitude for the distinct privilege of being integrated into an established name like Sullivan. I watched them, already planning how I would force them to put every single syllable of this extortion into a text thread before the sun went down. Only later did I understand what that moment really meant. What stayed with me wasn't the insult itself, but the absolute ease with which they inverted the guilt. When a family uses emotional loyalty to demand financial transparency from you while calling your request for legal transparency cold, the negotiation is already a fraud. They didn't want an independent partner. They wanted a blind wallet docile enough to finance their overhead without ever asking to read the contract. They had spent months treating me like a guest, only to demand I assume the liabilities of an owner. Amanda tilted her head, her eyes narrowing into two sharp slits of calculated authority as she delivered her ultimatum. The ancient grandfather clock in the corner ticked heavily, marking the freezing silence between us. If your family cannot handle the baseline maintenance of this legacy, Madison, perhaps we should reevaluate if you can handle the responsibilities of our name. I rose from the table without a sound. I thanked Amanda for the hospitality, stepped out into the crisp gray air of Beacon Hill, and immediately sent Taylor a follow-up text summarizing his mother's exact financial demands, waiting for his written confirmation. The absolute stillness of my body masked a frightening clarity. The next morning, I bypassed my architectural firm completely and drove to a high-rise office in the Boston Financial District to meet Mr. Vance, a senior real estate litigator specializing in historic property disputes. He did not offer any predictable, superficial words of empathy. Instead, he spread my parents' original bank wiring slips, the saved text logs, and the active county title registry across his wide mahogany desk, studying the data with the detached focus of a surgeon reviewing an advanced diagnostic report. This was where the first real-world friction point altered my calculations. Mr. Vance leaned back, his expression darkening as he pointed to the paperwork my father had signed weeks earlier. Because my father had trusted Taylor enough to sign a vaguely worded construction authorization form, under the impression it was a simple administrative step, the bank could not instantly freeze or reverse the $110,000. Legally, civil property laws required explicit written fraud declarations, mandatory corporate notices, and filing windows that would drag out across a timeline of 6 to 8 months. During that administrative delay, our original wedding date would long pass, and my family's entire life savings would remain trapped inside an asset legally owned by my brother-in-law. The systemic weight of the legal system felt crushing in its deliberate slowness. Looking out at the Boston Harbor from the high-rise window, I realized that traditional legal channels are structurally designed to protect the party that holds the title deed, not the party that provided the physical sweat and labor. It is a harsh truth that some forms of structural exploitation stay entirely invisible until you attempt to execute your own exit. The law is never an instant weapon of rescue. It is a clinical environment of sheer endurance where the side that manages their internal panic the longest eventually claims the territory. I sat in the leather chair, watching the financial clerks move past the frosted glass doors, completely contained. I could not simply run a standard domestic litigation strategy against an old money system that knew how to navigate administrative delays better than I did. If I attacked them from the surface, they would use that 6-month window to hide the assets or manipulate the narrative. I had to look past the superficial property dispute and find where their structural weight was actually shifting. I asked Mr. Vance how a family facing such obvious generational decline managed to secure a prime commercial bank line for a property of that scale. He smiled coldly, his fountain pen tracing a line beneath the recent corporate registration updates on the subsurface Austin property logs. The financial data revealed a much deeper structural rot. Following Mr. Vance's explicit diagnostic guidelines, I spent the next 48 hours auditing the subsurface registries of the historic property archives. I bypassed the standard, surface-level consumer real estate logs, choosing instead to execute an advanced administrative query through the state's commercial lien registries and corporate encumbrance filings at the Registry of Deeds. That was the exact moment the true, hidden baseline of their corruption became completely transparent. The Beacon Hill estate wasn't registered under Austin's name, simply out of an old money impulse for greedy parental favoritism or protective family planning. The transaction carried a far more predatory economic calculation. Amanda Sullivan had secretly cross-collateralized the historic building's title deed 6 months prior to our engagement announcement. She had weaponized the asset to secure a massive, high-risk commercial bailout loan for Austin's failing maritime shipping business down at the Boston Harbor docks. The $110,000 my parents had painstakingly scraped together through decades of manual labor wasn't going toward a joint restoration practice for Taylor and me. It was a calculated, zero-interest equity injection designed entirely to artificially inflate the building's appraised valuation, keeping the maritime banks from executing an immediate, catastrophic foreclosure on their entire family legacy. If Austin's commercial maritime venture defaulted within the next 90 days, a metric that looked entirely mathematical given their active tax delinquency logs and stranded cargo records, the entire Beacon Hill property would be legally liquidated by corporate creditors. My parents' 30 years of physical sacrifice would be swallowed to patch over the insolvency of a parasitic stranger's business failure. The most clinical, chilling realization wasn't even Amanda's transactional coldness. It was the fact that Taylor had been completely aware of the transaction timeline from our very first afternoon sketching the studio floor plans. He had sat beside me as I cataloged restoration costs, watching me verify contractor metrics, knowing perfectly well that we were pouring my family's liquid savings into an insolvent, sinking ship. Looking back across the years, that specific afternoon remains the moment everything became transparent. The shifting lines didn't just expose their fraud, they forced an absolute stabilization of my own internal compass. A partner who can watch your family bleed capital into their hidden liability loop has already checked out of the relationship. This wasn't a standard premarital disagreement or an ancient family eccentricity. It was a corporate-style asset extraction where my family was chosen to bear the structural risk of their decay. They had treated our relationship as a short-term liquidity facility, outsourcing their generational decline to my father's stonework. I printed out the verified cross-collateral ledger, watching the cold black ink dry on the undeniable proof of their fraud. My hands were perfectly steady as I filed the papers into my portfolio, completely finished with the illusion of our shared future. I knew that my next tactical movement would completely cut off the financial oxygen to their entire family network. My retaliation didn't require a single shouting match. At 8:30 a.m. on Monday, under Mr. Vance's clinical guidance, I shifted our counteroffensive entirely into the legal framework of the construction industry. I filed a formal mechanics lien against the Beacon Hill property for exactly $110,000. By leveraging the very construction authorization form they had tricked my father into signing, I legally reclassified our capital injection as specialized historic structural preservation and architectural masonry design services completed under my firm's active professional registration license. Under Municipal Construction Code, a mechanic's lien functions as an absolute encumbrance on a property title. It instantly freezes all active zoning permits, halts, construction code approvals, and completely blocks the title from being utilized as collateral for secondary corporate debt lines. Within 24 hours of the filing, the Sullivans' commercial credit structure ground to a violent halt. The Maritime Bank immediately flagged the title defect, freezing Austin's shipping capital lines and plunging their entire family legacy into an immediate, catastrophic liquidity emergency. When Taylor and his mother stormed Mr. Vance's office 3 days later alongside their high-priced attorneys, their typical old-money arrogance was completely gone. Amanda looked ancient, her face drawn, her hands trembling as Mr. Vance calmly printed out the certified logs of her own text messages, demanding the additional $35,000 alongside the audited cross-collateral logs. Her lawyers took one single look at the documented trail of structural fraud and immediately pulled Amanda into a private corner of the office, advising her that if this case reached an open civil courtroom, the public exposure would result in an absolute systemic destruction of their social standing. When everything collapsed, that sudden silence of that boardroom still felt sharper than any argument. That was the moment the illusion of power from their empty vault became fully visible to me. I understood that for people obsessed with surface presentation, status is merely a high-value cloak they rent with unearned equity. The moment the cold mathematical reality of a lien strips it away, they have zero internal architecture to keep them upright. They had spent decades treating their reputation as an unliquidated asset, assuming the world would always accept their family name as legal tender without ever inspecting the ledger. But there was no instant, perfect revenge fantasy. Because my family's capital had already been structurally integrated into the physical stone bricks of the building, I could not simply walk out of the room with immediate liquid cash. I was forced to accept a realistic, hard-fought trade-off, a structured settlement contract where Amanda transferred $40,000 immediately from her personal asset accounts, with the remaining $70,000 structured over a strict 6-month timeline secured by a hard, priority legal charge on the Beacon Hill property itself. I stood up from that conference table, leaving my heavy engagement ring sitting perfectly in the center of the dark mahogany wood without saying a single word. I walked out into the corridor, completely detached from the frantic, whispered strategy sessions breaking out behind me. The settlement took exactly 6 months to fully resolve. The systemic decay of the Sullivan legacy occurred with the quiet, unyielding precision of mathematical cause and effect, lacking any theatrical drama but carrying the absolute weight of reality. Unable to clear my priority lien from the Beacon Hill property within the strict legal window, Amanda Sullivan was forced to liquidate her private collection of antique silver and ancestral oil paintings at a severe loss to raise the remaining $70,000 owed to my parents. Shortly after the final installment cleared, Austin's maritime shipping venture collapsed into complete corporate liquidation, regardless of their fraudulent maneuvers, and the old money social circles they had spent generations occupying quietly removed their name from every historic board to protect their own public institutions from the financial scandal. Taylor's career as an asset manager evaporated under the public record of the title dispute, a professional whose transactional integrity is openly questioned in the county registries cannot find clients willing to trust him with their capital. The final structural installment cleared into my father's Quincy savings account down to the very last cent. Watching the dust finally settle across their legacy taught me something permanent about human masonry. I understand now that some structures are inherently unpreservable because they are engineered to collapse under the weight of their own internal deceptions. My parents did not hold a celebration or make a public display of their victory. My father simply wiped the granite dust from his fingers, picked up his old leather ledger book, and placed it back onto his workshop shelf with the profound calm of a craftsman who knows the structural lines have been restored to plumb. The 30 years of his labor were no longer an anonymous subsidy for a family that viewed him with condescension. They were an unshakable foundation returned fully to his own blood. I have established my independent architectural practice now, operating out of a quiet, sunlit brick loft in South Boston. There are no ancestral portraits on my walls, no illusions of unearned status, just the clean, solid reality of drafting paper, stone samples, and raw blueprints. Every morning I make my coffee, look out over the shifting surface of the river, and recognize that the greatest preservation victory in a person's life is not saving a relationship designed to exploit them. It is having the absolute structural clarity to step away, reclaim your materials, and build your own life on an independent foundation. Have you ever found yourself trying to build a career or a future with someone who expected you to provide all the liquid capital and heavy labor while they maintained absolute structural control? What would you have done if you uncovered the fraud just days before the contract was locked? If this story resonated with your own experiences, I would really like to hear your perspective on where you draw the line between family obligation and self-preservation.